My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And if I look flushed and overexcited to have Steven Pinker in our newsroom, that's half the reason for it. The other half is that as I got on the Bakerloo line, they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, there have been severe delays, signal failure at Piccadilly Circus." And I thought to myself, oh yeah, those signals have a mind of their own. And as I was then racing to come to meet Stephen, I thought, yeah, that's the problem we've got here, is that when we say we've got minds of our own, we probably think that those are deeply irrational and unreliable things. And that's going to be the nature of our conversation this morning, rationality. Stephen's written a new book. If I sound a little gushing, it's because I am. Enlightenment Now was one of the books that genuinely corrected a sense of anxiety and despondency in me about what was happening in the world and the way that we perceive it. And if this is the first time to the Tortoise Newsroom, I just want to tell you what a ThinkIn is. It's not intended to be a panel conversation where Stephen and I sort of come to a deeper understanding of the world. It's intended to be an hour in which we together come to a better understanding of things. And what I mean and what I hope in that is that everyone feels, as in a newsroom, as in a news meeting, that they can pipe up. We have a pretty loosely enforced rule, which is no questions. Seems excessively silly this morning, but the idea is we want to hear people's points of view. Often questions are actually points of view with a question mark at the end of it. Please feel free to tell us what you think, put the thoughts to Stephen, and we hope in the course of this hour we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to try and drag it in a particular direction, or in fact, to be more precise, I'm going to try and drag it downwards. I'm going to try and drag it into the world of news so that we try and understand, I think, one of the real criticisms of our politics and our media, this sense that we misrepresent or misunderstand the world and why that might be. But that's not all we're going to do. And I think, Stephen, it might be helpful if you would, just for making the case, explaining to us what rationality is. So let's start with that before we get into the world that I'm more familiar with.
I'm always challenged to define what I mean by rationality, and the dictionary is not much help because it often defines rationality in terms of reason. If you look up reason, it defines it in terms of rationality, and they both come from the same Latin root, so that wasn't much help. I define it as the use of knowledge to attain a goal. And just thinking through thoughts, it doesn't actually correspond to our sense of what it means to be rational. You've got to put it to use to either achieve something in the world, practical reason, or to come to interesting and useful truths, pure reason. That raises the question of how you can use knowledge to attain goals. And the answer is there's not a single answer because it depends on what the goal is, but there are a number of benchmarks of rationality, often called normative models in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, to be distinguished from descriptive models of how mortal humans actually do reason. But these are how we ought to reason if we were rational. And they include tools like logic, probability, Bayesian reasoning, that is calibrating your degree of credence in a hypothesis according to the strength of evidence, statistical decision theory, given that we're all fallible in our knowledge of the world, but we have to come to a decision. How do we set a cutoff based on the strength of the evidence, balancing the costs and benefits of errors in both directions, namely false alarms and misses? Game theory, what is the rational thing to do when the outcome depends on what other rational people decide to do? Distinguishing correlation and causation, the theory of expected utility or rational choice. None of these is a psychological theory. They are all ways that an ideal reasoner ought to reason. And so that provides us something of an answer of what we mean by rationality, which then sets up the question of how well do poor schlemiels like ourselves measure up to these normative
Well, I'm
models.
glad you describe yourself as a poor schlemiel, because I have to say there's a lovely thing in the book, you know, when you're in the first few pages and you discover you're in safe hands, you're going to have a lovely time here, right? And really early on, there's this just throwaway line that Stephen has, which is that I think it's 37% of us believe in haunted houses, and 32% of us believe in ghosts. And then he just puts in as a sort of just a note, he goes, which means that there are some people who believe in haunted houses, but not ghosts. And the thing that's great about that is, of course, I read that and thought, those fools. And then about sort of 6-10 pages further on, we start getting into questions of logic, and you start putting these tests to people. And I was reading going, oh God, I'm failing them all. I get one after the next wrong, and I fall for every single trick. And I suppose I wanted to just put you, one of the things that you say about rationality that is the sort of starting point is around knowledge. Because I think if we're going to talk about how we understand facts, one of the things that's contested are facts themselves. And you describe knowledge as, I think it is, justified true belief. That's the difference.
But I just lift that from philosophy, epistemology 101.
So how do you distinguish what is as rationally justified to you, but not rationally justified to someone else?
Right. So the definition of knowledge appeals to justification as a universal, almost Platonic standard. That is, there exists a justification separately from what I think of as a justification, or you might think of as a justification. But the practical question of how does each one of us justify our beliefs, the real answer is that we often trust people who know more about it than we do. That very few people can explain the basis, can actually justify their beliefs in terms of retracing the train of reasoning, the chain of evidence that really does justify them. We assume that the people in the white coats, the people who write encyclopedias, kind of know what they're talking about. Now, if you don't assume that, then you've got the carnival of crazy beliefs that we do see, namely the people who believe in the conspiracy theories that the jet contrails are mind-altering drugs dispersed by a secret government program. They have their experts. We dismiss them not because we're experts on jet contrails. I think very few people could provide a coherent explanation of what jet contrails really are, or how they're formed. But if you're alienated from the conventional forms of expertise, then you'll be open to alternatives. And there are studies of belief in that defy scientific consensus, such as human-made climate change, which show that the deniers are no less scientifically educated than the acceptors. Even a lot of people who accept that human activity is warming the planet will say, "Oh yeah, doesn't that have something to do with the ozone hole, or toxic waste dumps, or plastic straws in the oceans?" I mean, most people are out to lunch when it comes to climate science, even if they believe the correct, or at least the scientific consensus. And conversely, many deniers, in order to make the case all the stronger, they really do a deep dive into climate science, finding the polemicists who capitalize on every ambiguity in the state of knowledge to mount a lawyerly case on the other side. What determines people's acceptance of the scientific consensus is simply how far to the right or the left they are on the political spectrum, not how much science they know.
And Stephen, I'm struck by your use of the word loyally. You wouldn't say journalistic. So how rational do you think the news industry is?
Glad you asked. This is a
clear your diary, everyone. Yeah.
This is something I've thought about over the course of 3 books. The previous 2, The Enlightenment Now and The Better Angels of Our Nature. It forced me to think about that because of the data that I presented on historical trends and various indicators of human well-being. In the case of The Better Angels of Our Nature, I plotted 75 graphs of violence over time. And in fact, I wrote that book when I myself was surprised to see graphs on something like, say, war deaths per capita over since say 1946, when quantitative records were first kept. I was astonished to see the line go down, that the rate of death from war now is about 1/20th of what it was in the late 40s and early 50s. And that's not even counting World War II, which would be literally off the charts. that violence against women has declined in the United States by 75%. Rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse has been in decline. These are like major social trends that you'd have no way of knowing being an informed person who reads the news. And not because of any nefarious motive on the part of journalists. So I take care to distinguish myself from the people who say, oh, the mainstream media are corrupt and they're a bunch of liars and they're just chasing eyeballs and clicks. It isn't that kind of cynical view, but I think there is a built-in distorter in just the very nature of news, even with the best of motives, which is that the news is a non-random sample of what's happening on Earth. It's discrete events as opposed to long-term trends, things that happen as opposed to things that don't happen, things that happen suddenly as opposed to things that build up over time, and hence my interest in tortoise media. And so you can be a news literate, fully informed consumer of information about the world and be just like out to lunch about the state of the world. And in fact, polls show that that is true. When crime is declining, a majority of people think it's increasing. Bobby Duffy, in his book, The Perils of Perception, I think he works for Ipsos Mori, the public opinion firm, wrote a whole book on people's radical misconceptions of the state of the world, very clearly driven by amount of news coverage. So for example, if you ask people to estimate what proportion of the population is of African descent or Jewish, it's like 10 times the real figure, just because these are minorities that, for whatever reason, can't stay out of the news. And the more you read about them, the more prevalent you think they are. It connects to a pretty robust and long-standing finding in psychology, which is that one of the classic biases in human cognition, originally documented by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Tversky died in 1996, far too young. Kahneman went on to win the Nobel Prize and then wrote the bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow. But one of their biases they documented is called availability. Namely, we, rather than estimating probability in the way that the mathematicians say we should, namely number of occurrences divided by number of opportunities, we base our sense of probability on how easily examples come to mind. If you can think of an anecdote, an image, a story, then you think it's commonplace. And that's exactly what happens with our perception of the state of the world. It's driven by the events we read about in the news, and so people wildly overestimate not only prevalence of newsworthy minorities, but the prevalence of terrorist deaths, of police shootings, of rampage killings, of plane crashes. One of my favorite examples of this kind of news-driven ignorance is that in the United States, people think that tornadoes kill more people than asthma attacks. Now, tornadoes are highly photogenic. Asthma attacks, not so much, but probably asthma attacks kill 40 times as many people as tornadoes, but people get it exactly wrong and clearly driven by news coverage.
And Stephen, okay, I fear we're in for a chastening hour here.
Well, not at Tortoise Media.
No, I think us too. But I suppose I wanted, given that you have thought about it over the course of 3 books, and listening to you, I was thinking about one of the first lessons you learn as a journalist. You get told the story of the young reporter goes to a wedding, comes back, tells the editor there was no story, the bride didn't show up. and of course, at most weddings, the bride does show up happily, but that is the definition of a story.
Yes.
Right? And so I wondered whether or not you think that what you're dealing with in news is psychological. It's the human interest in the exceptional, not just the pictures, but the nature of our own human curiosity, or it's commercial. If it bleeds, it leads. Or the intersection of those two things. What's driving, do you think, what you described as a new phrase, news-driven ignorance?
Yes. Well, those two explanations are, in a sense, one explanation, that the reason that it leads if it bleeds is that we do have a morbid interest in violence. We pay to see it simulated. It's called, entertainment. Mafia movies and war pictures and Shakespearean tragedies and westerns, Greek epics. We love to consume simulated violence. And it'd be an interesting kind of psychological issue of why it should be so morbidly fascinating, but it is. And news will necessarily cater to that curiosity. And so there is probably disproportionate coverage of violence, with the perverse consequence that it creates a market niche for violence entrepreneurs who commit acts of violence for no purpose other than getting in the news. And we call them terrorists, and we call them rampage shooters.
Yeah. And what do you say? Because I think one of the defenses that you'd hear from mainstream media, and it's not as much a defense even as a cry of despair, is it doesn't seem to matter anymore what information you put into the public square. Even if you're fact-based, and even if you make a rational argument, it's not necessarily heard. So I wanted to take, if I could, 3 examples, and let's start with one. Vaccine hesitancy, right? How do you explain, and let's take the US as a good example, the scale of vaccine hesitancy in the United States, and in particular places? You can't be making the argument that the southern states of the United States are more irrational than the northern states of the United States.
Yeah, so there's several things going on with vaccine hesitancy. One of them is that we have the baseline of the fact that vaccines are deeply counterintuitive. And there's been vaccine hesitancy for as long as there's been vaccines. I think when Jenner introduced cowpox vaccination, there were editorial cartoons showing cows growing up popping out of people's bodies, cow heads. The reason is that we all have a intuitive sense of essentialism. That is, that there is kind of a healthy nature of stuff that courses through our bodies and veins, and that sickness comes from external adulterants or contaminants or pollutants. That's why culture after culture has rediscovered bloodletting as a cure for illness, and purging and cupping and pull out the toxins. Conversely, actually injecting a disease agent into your blood, into your body, you just have to get over that psychological barrier to accept vaccination. And to do that, you have to, of course, trust the scientific establishment who says, really, this is good for you. We're going to inject you with a weakened form of the virus, but don't worry, this will protect you. Now, they're right. The question is, what does it take to overcome that natural tendency? So first, it does require kind of trust and solidarity with the biomedical establishment. The other part of it, and relevant to why the southern states, so of all of the cognitive biases that Tversky and Kahneman and others have documented, and it has become something of a parlor game to add to the list. Wikipedia has a page of cognitive biases, and I think there are 200 of them. Of them, perhaps the most robust and pervasive is called the my side bias, kind of self-explanatory, namely that we endorse the beliefs that are sacred values, rallying cries, tests of membership of a particular coalition or tribe or sect. And it gains us status in our group when we endorse them. It leads to shaming and opprobrium and ostracism when we deny them within our group. And that is an extraordinarily powerful motivator of belief. It exists on the left and on the right. It is independent of IQ. It tends to be specific to particular issues. So if a particular issue happens to attach itself to a tribe or coalition, and there may be something a bit arbitrary as to which issues become sacred values or rallying cries. And it's not obvious that vaccination would become a kind of a membership badge of the populist right. And in fact, there is a faction of resistance from the kind of holistic green left.
And so, Stephen, by the way, please don't wait, don't be shy, because before you know it, the hour will be gone and you won't have a chance. You want to weigh in? Yes, sir. Would you just introduce yourself? Yeah, because it's... So would you just introduce yourself and wait for the subtly branded microphone?
Very cool. My name's Kevin Flanagan. I've been reading your books for 30 years. I'm intrigued about the recent departure towards, abstractions, coming from how do we acquire language, how do we use what's it being used for, what's it useful for. But you mentioned Kahneman and Tversky, and Kahneman's recent book, Noise, talks about the fact that we're subject to these two problems, noise and bias, that we can't control. And that's the subtlety, I think, that most people miss about Kahneman's first book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is that that fast system happens before we're even conscious of it, because it's the fight or flight response. It's don't be lunch on the savannah, eat lunch on the savannah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem we have. We have this ideal of rationality, but we're dealing with that Neolithic system that's still in our brains, that's programmed from birth, right? And we're trying to use language to describe things that are abstractions, but we only have education about abstractions in the last 80 years. I mean, I think there's something in that, but I'd love you to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I begin the book on the savannah, or more accurately on the Kalahari Desert, even a harsher lifestyle than the savannah. Because I argue that we shouldn't blame the rampant irrationality around us on the hunter-gatherers, because they're actually pretty rational. They have no choice. They depend on pretty complex chains of inference and in fact they don't rely on system one. They question their first impressions. They debate. Now I'm talking about tracking. So in persistence hunting, which may be the oldest form of human hunting, it's not very glamorous. Basically, the hunters chase an animal until it keels over a heat stroke, and then they kind of bash it on the head or dispatch it with a spear or an arrow, taking advantage of the only advantages that we humans have over other mammals, which are much faster than us. But we are naked, so we sweat, we dump heat. They're furry, so they overheat, and we're bipedal, so we can run efficiently over very long distances. An antelope can sprint away very quickly, but not only for short bursts. And so if they track them by their hoofprints and other spoor, they can just kind of harry and follow this animal until it keels over. That crucially depends, since it darts out of sight, on inferring which way it went, what species it was, what age, what sex, what condition, from really fragmentary clues. And they engage in critical thinking. They don't settle for arguments from authority. A young upstart can challenge one of the tribal elders. They engage in what I call unlogic. That is, if there are two species, one of which has 3 toes and the other has 2, but they know that sometimes hard ground doesn't register all 3 toe prints, they know that if an animal has, if there's a track with 3 prints, it can only indicate a honey badger. If it's 2 prints, it might indicate a honey badger or a porcupine. They don't commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So system 2 is part of the human birthright, part of our inheritance for as long as we've been human. And the question is, why don't we always deploy it?
Yeah, man, good idea. Well, yes, though, because you'll know when you've got it. There it is.
Hi, I'm Cecilia. I'm a linguist. And so I'll try not to talk too much nerd, but I believe we're getting to something here when we're talking about people and the way that news and everything's reported by a sort of pragmatic, so the inference suggests, because I think it all reduces at the moment to who wants to be a hero. If you take the recent information about COVID, how to keep safe, hands, face safe, all the conversations are directed in the direction of saying, be a hero. It's like the savannah thing, be the hero, overcome the beast, have the injection, do it for the community. Everyone's being sold this cowboy narrative in some way, but it's very nuanced and it's in everything.
Yeah.
So, but sorry, that's my 2 penneths.
Cecilia, thank you. Do you want to reply to that? Because I definitely see it in COVID, and you see it actually on both sides of the argument. Both sides adopt that.
Indeed, and I'm spending a sabbatical year in Berkeley, California, and there wearing masks has become something of a fashion statement. People on a hiking trail, in the middle of nowhere, and you come across them, they're wearing a mask. People driving by themselves in a car and they're wearing a mask. So it's obviously a much more benevolent kind of virtue signaling. You don't hurt anyone wearing a mask by yourself. But it is a kind of virtue signaling, and we all, and the my side bias is very much a motivated by, if not necessarily being a hero within your coalition, although there can be that, particularly when it comes to more outre and outlandish beliefs. There is, because if a belief is too obvious, if I believe that rocks fall down and don't float up, well, anyone can say that. What kind of cachet do I gain within any social group for saying something that's so obviously true? But if I say something that appears to be false, such as that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring out of a pizzeria, and if I'm in a faction that hates Hillary Clinton, it's like, wow, that's really, even I wouldn't have thought of that. But even more powerful is actually the opprobrium of defying a consensus position within your coalition. The other side of gaining status if you propose something that's a especially effective talking point.
Stephen, I should just say, we're joined by a whole bunch of people who are watching us on screen. And so, by the way, I haven't just been checking this to find out what my next question is. I've been checking it because lots of people have got points in the chat. And I'm going to bring in a couple, if I might. I'm going to bring in Paul Lusk, and I'm going to bring in Anthony Cope. They're actually, Cecilia, will enjoy this if you're a lover of linguistics. Anthony Cope wanted to ask Stephen about what he called shits in rationality, and they went, no, not shits, shifts in rationality. Fundamental changes. So I'm going to ask him about that, because it is interesting about when our sort of baseline changes, and Paul Luskram, interesting point about sort of vested interests. I saw a hand here, sir, and I'm going to come to you in a moment. So yes, far away. Oh, microphone, sorry, sorry. Claudia's got the microphone here.
Hi, Stephen. George Dara, VC investor. Following on from the comment on thinking fast and thinking slow, one of the fascinating pieces of that is, of course, trained statisticians make all the biases or make all the errors in the series of tests that Danny and Amos set up. And perhaps I'm wondering about yourself. When we're reading Rationality or Enlightenment Now, what are the biases that you find yourself falling into, and how should we look at this book through the lens of what is Stephen thinking and what biases does he fall into?
The problem is I'm the last person to ask. Because
you're the right person to ask.
Because one of the biases, sometimes called the bias. Namely, everyone thinks that everyone else is biased, but not themselves. And so, so I'm probably not the right person to ask. And sometimes people do ask me, well, as an advocate of rationality, part of rationality is changing your mind. When the evidence changes, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? John Maynard Keynes did not, in fact, say that, but it's attributed to him, and it's a great quote.
He didn't say that.
He did not. I looked it up. I chased it down. It was probably Paul Samuelson, another economist, but attributed to Keynes. And he said something similar. But the thing is that as I write my books, I try my hardest, granted with all of my biases that I probably don't see, to anticipate criticisms. I speak about the subject matter of the book in public forums before I complete the draft, so I know what the objections are, try to meet them or try to change my mind. So when the ink is just dried and the book comes out and they say, what have you changed your mind about? It's kind of like, if I say, well, nothing yet, it isn't that I myself, so I will argue, it's not that I myself am a kind of a stubborn person who is ignorant of the very biases he tries to expose, but rather they've already gone into the book, and it's unlikely that there'd be a new objection that I would not have heard as I discuss it while writing the book. So I like to think that it's to my humanly best possibility, free of any obvious biases. But with the caveat of the philosophers talk about the preface paradox. When you open a book, in the preface, the author thanks all the people, says all the remaining errors are my own fault. You might say, well, gee, why didn't you fix the errors? And the answer is, well, I know there must be errors, I just don't know what they are.
Right. Stephen, can I just ask you, though, because I think that by definition, people in this room are going to be fans of yours and interested in your book. There are people who were infuriated by Enlightenment Now.
Don't I know it?
And they will be, and some of them will be infuriated by Rationality too. Rationality, they'll be infuriated because I think they'll think they're being patronized. in the sense that you're making an argument for cognitive thinking, for intelligent debate and discussion. They're saying, no, we're being intelligent. You just work off a set of facts that you think are facts, but you have less evidence to believe than we think is justified. And in Enlightenment now, the frustration was even deeper. The frustration was that the argument for the overall improvements in economic well-being were disguising real suffering and real power gaps and real inequality that wasn't necessarily captured in the kind of global data. And so how do you respond to those two things, that your overall data disguises lived experience and that you work off a set of mainstream facts that may yet prove to be untrue?
Yeah. Well, the first one, I'm always, I must say, kind of flabbergasted by the criticism, because you say, for example, that global poverty has decreased, that war has decreased, and as I made clear, that's not the same as saying it's disappeared. I mean, if, say, extreme poverty has declined from 90% of the world's population to 9%, well, 9% is still 700 million people or more. And to say that it's better that there are fewer poor people than there used to be isn't to say that it's okay that there are poor people. Quite the and so I just, I consider that criticism, I know it's going to sound patronizing, but it's like, it's a mathematical error. To say something that has declined is not to say it disappeared. To say X is less than Y does not imply that X is not the same as saying that X is 0. Mm-hmm. But that is the nature of the criticism. Well, what about all the people who are still being killed in wars? Well, yeah, we should try to protect them, but it's better if it's 100,000 people a year than if it's 1 million people per year. That's 900,000 people who didn't die. And it isn't being callous to the remaining 100,000 people. I would say, on the contrary, it's emboldening us to try to drive the numbers still lower, emboldened by the fact that if we've reduced it by that much so far, then if not eliminating it, certainly driving it down as much as possible. It's not romantic, it's not utopian, it doesn't depend on optimism. It is a practicable achievement.
But what do you say to people? And sorry, I'm going to come back. I said there's a gentleman here, and I did say I'd bring kind of Paul and Anthony and others in. But I just want to pursue this for a second, because you started off making a set of observations about the news. And I guess I want to try and understand what's happening to public debate, because part of the argument in this book is around fake news and conspiracy theories. I don't want to presume your politics, but what do you say to those people who, if they were debating, for example, Brexit, or they were campaigning against Donald Trump, they said, look, we marshaled quote unquote rational arguments, right? But they had no effect. By implication, they are saying that the people who won those arguments were irrational. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that?
With the people who actually prevailed in Brexit, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So that those people who argued against quote unquote populism say that actually the political square, politics, has surrendered to the irrational.
So the question is, how would a critic of Trump or Brexit address a supporter?
Yes.
Well, certainly the tactic of just assuming that they're irrational is probably not a good starting point, simply because in any civil debate there's got to be a presumption of mutual rationality, that people can be mistaken without being irrational, or at least more irrational than the other side.
And do you think that's true? Hold on, let's just check. Do you think that's true? Do you think there is mutual rationality on both sides of those debates?
No, but I wouldn't, would I? So I have.
No, but that's very significant.
Yeah,
Stephen, that's very significant, because part of the problem here is, if you're pitting rational against the irrational, then the arguments for the way in which political debate, liberal democracy, effective government is going to work, that all of those hopes are blown.
Right. So if people on the other side are incapable of rationality, that is, they are beyond persuasion
politically, yeah. Or yeah. It's not they're incapable, but it's not necessary to win.
Right. Well, it certainly isn't necessary to win, because you can always, I mean, in the extreme case, take over governance by force, by a military coup. So we know it certainly isn't necessary. Mm-hmm. What's the long-term viability of liberal democracy, where our aspiration is that in the marketplace of ideas, the argument that proves to be most effective is the one that is actually implemented? And that is an aspiration. I think it's very much worth defending, and it depends on reinforcing mechanisms like free speech, open debate, and a culture of on both sides, because the my side bias afflicts the left as well as the right, which is why I was hesitant in saying, well, they really are irrational, and why I said, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? We have to. There has to be a part of the culture is acknowledging one's own fallibility, and therefore willingly surrendering to neutral regimes of fact-checking, hosting of debate, commitment to norms of rationality, asserting beliefs in degrees of confidence rather than in black and white terms. There's a kind of nerdy subculture called the rationality community that tries to affirm and live by these principles, and they should be more of our common culture. That is, instead of thinking of debate as a kind of a blood sport, as that steadfastness in your opinions is a virtue because it shows how courageous and principled you are, the ethos of changing your mind when the data changes. This is not something that can be legislated from the top down because it is a norm.
But sorry, Stephen, I just want to press you for one second further, because I suppose, honestly and emotionally, I find myself really swinging between incredible excitement about the age we're living in and a certain degree of despair. Really, really worried. And I just want to know where you are, because what you're describing there is a world in which you don't need to be rational to win. The winner does implement laws and systems and distribution of resources, and the sum of that impacts the extent to which we end up believing in liberal democracy or not, the extent to which it works. And if you take the line of what you're saying, you would end up, I think, with a pretty worried view for the future of liberal democracy.
Yeah, so I think liberal democracy always has to push back against our the irrationalities that are built into human nature. And in fact, this is not a new insight. It was explicitly stated by the framers of the American Constitution, the founders. So in the Federalist Papers, in the arguments from James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine and John Adams, it was, how do we, given that humans really do have all these flaws, and they were quite cognizant of them, they didn't have the same names for them, how can we set up a system, almost like a game with rules, so that we can collectively come to wise decisions, even acknowledging that we're not going to perfect human nature. This is what I think of as the genius of the American framers. I mean, for all of the flaws that they baked into the Constitution, there are plenty, they themselves were not infallible. But the design of liberal democracy, and the reason that it's the best system except for, the worst system except for all the other ones that have tried, is that it does acknowledge the fact that we're always up against human biases. In theory, as Madison put it, ambition is made to counter ambition. That is, one person, everyone will have their flaws, but everyone also has the motive to point out other people's flaws. And we're pretty good at that, even when we commit them ourselves. And some of the classic fallacies that you teach in cognitive psychology, you put people together in a group, they actually do much better than the individual simpleton, as it would appear. That some of these logical fallacies that 90% of people make, you put them in a group and only 20 to 30% make it. All it takes is for one person to point out the correct solution, and everyone immediately kind of slaps themselves on the forehead and say, oh, of course.
Oh, really?
That can happen. It's not, I'm not going to say it always happens, because there's also the phenomenon of groupthink, of
Yes.
premature consensus. But what it does is it focuses our attention on the system, on the norms, the institutions, the rules of engagement that, when they work well, ought to lead a group to better, more objective understandings, even with all the flaws that we're all saddled with. Now, of course, that can also break down. And I think that when you have, say, restrictions on free speech and academic freedom and freedom of the press, that's when they break down. If certain opinions are criminalized, that means that we'll never discover whether they're true or false.
So, listen, let me take a few from George. Will you see if you can bring in Paul Lusk, just because he's got a specific question I saw, and I did want to come back to Anthony Cope, and then I'm going to come to you in a second. Paul, good morning.
Morning. Thank you very much, James. I wasn't expecting to be called in, but anyway, I think my point is about this question really, which you're trying to pursue about why is it so difficult to have rational debate about public issues? And I'm really commenting on Stephen's suggestion that this is basically to be seen in psychological and kind of self-identity terms. And I gave the example of the housing debate, which is one I follow closely, where it's constantly asserted that the problem is a shortage of housing stock in the UK, and therefore building homes is the only solution. Now, in fact, there's a very well-attested argument which housing economists understand very well. Housing stock has grown pretty consistently ahead of population growth. We have 40% more housing stock than we did 60 years ago, but prices 8 times affordability compared with 3 times average income 60 years ago. What's actually going on is that the tax system has incentivized people to under-occupy their housing, or put it another way, over-consume housing. So a vast proportion of our housing stock now is owner-occupied by single-person households occupying 3-bedroom homes. Now, my point really is that the reason this argument is excluded from the public debate is that it is so challenging to the vested interests of actually the majority of the population. So it seems to me that the fundamental question for liberal democracy is have we reached the point where the relatively short-term consumer interests of the bulk of the population now really have overtaken the possibility of a long-term strategic approach to our resources? And the climate change is a similar one. So I wasn't trying to kick off a debate about housing, but I was trying to, although it'd be an interesting one to have, but I was really trying to widen this discussion about the relationship of public discussion and liberal democracy, which I think is really crucial. I call my generation is the please me generation. We're the ones who were in our teens when the first Beatles #1 came out in Britain, and it seems to me we have consumed.
Can I interrupt you? And certainly one of the things that's been a theme, certainly for us, is this sort of generational argument between younger people and boomers. We're going to get to that. Stephen, before just responding to that, to the sort of short-term versus long-term kind of consumer versus producer interest, I'm going to take in just a couple of other voices. And then, George, just to give you the heads up, I'm going to come to Katie Driver and Anthony Cope in a minute. You've got the mic, and then I'm going to come to you, sir.
My name is Laura. Thank you. So many thoughts come to mind. But one just to explore is this question of rational thought versus irrational. And I think many of us were quite surprised to have a new concept introduced a few years ago, which is alternative facts. And very often those that I might think are making irrational arguments or starting from an irrational point of view actually believe themselves to be quite rational because they are basing their opinion on media or on what some authorities tell them, or in the case of people I know about the vaccine, the friend of the friend who got terribly ill when they had the vaccine and may be in hospital.
Yes, and I actually identify this in the book as a case of journalistic malpractice. When you have, for there to be any news coverage of the small minority of people who get COVID despite being vaccinated, even though we know that the efficacy of the vaccines is not 100%. So it's actually not news if someone gets vaccinated and gets COVID. We knew from the most effective, from the efficacy studies of the most effective vaccine, it was bound to happen. But then you do have reports in the news of Joe so-and-so and who I got doubly vaccinated, but I still got COVID, and you know, his family and what happened to him, and maybe he died. Now, this is the kind of journalistic coverage that I consider to be malpractice, because it does cement in people's minds, oh, I guess vaccines aren't all that effective after all.
Can I ask you just, Stephen, what you would like to, I see Stuart Roden, and I'm going to ask him to come in as well, if I might, because he was making a point saying, could we have some corrective, some kind of daily page of good news?
Yes, okay.
Those things don't always work. What's your remedy for malpractice?
The problem of kind of good news and positive news, and I've heard this in my conversations with journalists, is that people kind of associate it with human interest fluff. Cop buys groceries for single mom, puppy befriends orangutan, that kind of thing.
That's a good story.
But I think that's not the remedy, because the thing is that people just categorize it as, oh, they're desperately trying to find some good news to cheer me up, and you know, I appreciate that, but you know, the world's still going to hell, but at least I have a smile on my face for a few seconds. So that's not it. It's rather more data savvy journalism that puts events in reporting them into statistical perspective, because the default, what happens is, there's a news story, people will think it's prevalent. So that's just something that I think journalism should just take into account. That is going to be the impression. And how can we at the same time convey interesting things that are happening, but not feed this distortion? And part of the answer might be that's just journalistic practice, together with a lot of other norms and mores of journalism, to put any story into statistical context. I mean, yes, this happened, but this is the prevalence. This is its, you know, how often it happens compared to the alternative. Also, I think there should be more, that the news section of the paper should take some lessons from the sports and business pages, where they have tables of numbers every day. Yeah. And the editor doesn't say, oh, people, they're innumerate, they're afraid of numbers, no one wants data, they want images, they want, you know, stories. Well, not the people who read the sports page or the business page, so why couldn't the news include, maybe this is a suggestion for Tortoise, kind of a dashboard of the world that is, what's happened to figures on violent crime, on war deaths, on carbon emissions, on violence against women, on anything that can be tracked, so that it isn't just anecdotes about things that go wrong, but also a sense of which way the country is going. Something more like they cite Our World in Data by Max Roser, which is it just that gives you a very different picture of the world. And I just want to, if I can just add one more comment before ceding the floor, but this pertains to the facts that motivate authoritarian populism like Donald Trump and the equivalents in other countries, and Brexit in Britain. That a lot of it was driven by a dystopian view of our current moment, captured in Donald Trump's notorious inaugural address on American carnage, at a time when crime rates were at a historic low point. But nonetheless, there's certainly enough incidents in the news so you could readily believe that crime is going out of control, which people always believe, because all of the incidents get reported, and the safe neighborhoods, you know, aren't news. And likewise with Brexit, with the general cynicism about government. And then I noticed just this morning in Tortoise Media, there was an op-ed by Matthew D'Anconia on the general fatalism, cynicism, and hatred of government that, at least however indirectly, may have played a role in the assassination of Amos. And that comes about when people are fed a diet of all of the failures of government, but never the successes. And again, this is not kind of happy talk of, you know, why don't we accentuate the positive, but just if you saw the trends for the kinds of things that government policy tries to mitigate, turns out that a lot of them kind of succeed. And I must say, as a consumer of news myself, I was stunned in seeing the very graphs that I reported in Better Angels and Enlightenment Now. It really changed my view of a lot of policies. So, for example, traffic deaths per capita or even per passenger mile have plunged. And that's because of safety regulations and traffic enforcement and all of these policies that I can sometimes resent as a person who feels, oh, the nanny state is telling me to do all these things for my own good, and the smoke alarms that go off when you overcook a chicken, and the fences around the swimming pools, and all of these daily nuisances, which feel like daily nuisances until you realize, man, they've worked.
Yeah.
You're less likely to drown than you were 20 or 30 years ago. Likewise for poverty. Ronald Reagan famously said, some years ago we declared war on poverty, and poverty won. Now that was a talking point for the American right. We've got to dismantle the welfare programs and government in general. Another laugh line from Reagan is, the most terrifying words from the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Now that's funny if you agree that every government program fails. Now, and if you read the news, you could sincerely believe that every government program fails. So where are you going to read that pollution has actually gone down thanks to the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, that the drownings and car crash deaths and war deaths have gone down? If you're ignorant about that, you're ignorant about a major component, a major pillar of liberal democracy, namely that democratic governance is better than a lot of the alternatives. It's not a train wreck, a flaming dumpster. How are you going to learn that? Where are you going to read it? The problem is not in the papers. And that's a real problem for corrosion of belief in liberal democracy.
Stephen, I'm going to an amazing act of self-denial, which is I'm not going to respond to that, but encourage a few other people to weigh in. I'm going to come to you, ma'am, in a second. But there are three people, if I might, and you, sir, at the back, I'll come in one moment. But there are three people online. I want to make sure we hear from people who are not in the room as well. Stuart Roden had a point, Katie Driver, and I said I'd come to Anthony Cope. George, will you just see if we can just tee each of those up? Stuart, are you there first? If not, is he there, George? Oh, there he is.
we go. Sorry, no,
Stuart, good morning.
Hi, Jim. So that was my point that we've just covered. So you can move on.
Okay,
exactly
very
the point.
good of you, Stuart.
Thank you.
That's extremely efficient. You're the best and most succinct contributor in the history of Tortoise.
It got through. Thank you.
Hi there.
Hi there. Yes, I'm not sure which point it was, but I wonder whether it was about trying to manage the interface between rationality and complexity, and the fact that we're actually living in a complex and messy world where everything's connected to everything else. So I'm interested in how we become rational enough to cope with, the reality as we see it. So I'm thinking about kind of systems like, trying to define what is A&E and be very rational about how you manage an A&E department, but that lends people to think, well, what counts as A&E? So there's all sorts of stuff to take into account in your rationality because we live in a complex world. So interested in Stephen's thoughts on that, or anybody else's.
Katie, sorry, Stephen, just before you reply, Katie, thank you. I'm just going to get Anthony's contribution too, because he talked about shifts in rationality when things fundamentally change. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, morning, James.
Morning.
Yes, I've done the shifts mistake a couple of times in my life, and all embarrassing. Stephen, it's been really interesting this morning, but I just wanted to make a point going back to news media and facts. People like Galileo at the time of the Enlightenment were totally run down by the prevailing media, the church, etc., etc. But eventually they became accepted facts in the mainstream and rational. So how does that actually happen? Because there has to be a paradigm shift in thoughts and rationality. Otherwise, we'll still be thinking the Earth is flat and, do you know what I mean? Eating dung.
So we'll come. Anthony, thank you. Oh, yeah, hold on, but if you are about to make it, then will you make it with a microphone? Sorry, ma'am, then I will come to you. And then, so I'm going to.
Can I respond? Okay.
Yes.
So,
I forget.
my name's Eric, I'm a musicologist. I would just wonder when it's rational to be irrational. And by that, I mean, let's take, for example, philosophers, mathematicians, scientists. They all say that time, as we understand it, doesn't flow in a certain direction. at all. But obviously it's rational for everybody to do that because that's how it works. And so culturally, is rationality actually a cultural concept? And does that go against perhaps the Platonic view of an objective truth?
Several things.
Okay, complexity, heresy,
Yes.
and culture.
Oh,
Off you go.
excellent, yes. So complexity. It is a profound point, and another of one of the pioneers in study of human cognition and rationality, Herbert Simon, introduced the concept of bounded rationality. Namely, since perfect rationality depends on perfect knowledge, perfect information, which no one ever will have, and on unlimited resources for reasoning, infinite memory, unlimited time, perfect rationality is unattainable, and instead part of rationality is factoring in the limitations in our ability to rationally come to a conclusion. And he introduced the notion of satisficing, which is instead of finding an optimal solution, find the first solution that is good enough, that meets some criterion. And as mortals, as opposed to angels, our rationality is bounded, and we have to factor in our own fallibility, our own limitations in processing information into our own rational decision making. That given that we'll never have perfect knowledge, how do we cope? What's the best that we can do? Mm-hmm. And indeed, methods of reducing complexity, or at least making complexity more transparent to our feeble human minds, is, I think, an important goal in rationality, such as better methods of data graphics, mm-hmm. Better methods of conveying probabilities in a mind-friendly format. And I talk about a couple in the book that can actually turn people into kind of fallacy mongers into actually more intuitive statisticians.
So rationality can be our friend in dealing with complexity.
Yes, and the goal of allowing us to cope with complex information can itself be something that we aspire to. Mm-hmm. Namely, given that we have cognitive limitations, given that the world is far more complex than we can than we can understand in its entirety, how do we present data in a form that our primate brains can grasp?
And Stephen, do you want to touch on this point about both heresy and,
yes, and
this cultural point?
So yes, the encouraging conclusion about the history of heresy is that the truth can prevail, and sometimes rather rapidly. And this is an answer to the question, well, should we just, and related to your earlier question of should we despair about the future of liberal democracy because we're saddled with all of these biases and fallacies and tribalism. And the answer is that it can happen sometimes quite quickly in terms of, say, the decline of racial segregation, of Jim Crow and apartheid regimes, the precipitous decline of criminalization of homosexuality and the adoption of gay marriage. Some of them happen actually quite rapidly in our lifetimes. And even though 32% of people believe in ghosts, but probably a couple of centuries ago, 100% of people would believe in ghosts. So, and very few people believe in omens and in eclipses. Even Donald Trump with his 30,000 lies, none of them involved paranormal phenomena, ESP. So there is a kind of slow-moving and sometimes precipitous changes in conventional wisdom that can be in the direction.
And so do you want to? So I didn't hear your name, sir. Eric, I didn't hear the point about time, rationality and time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's so much. It's not so much that it's irrational to believe that time flows. It's a different. There are cases where there can be a different kind of framing, a different way of grasping an underlying reality that makes concessions to the nature of human cognition. Given it's the only mind we have, as long as we can take the physics courses and kind of shift back and forth between the intuitive but literally incorrect conception and the ability to see beyond it when it matters. Maybe a simpler example than the illusory nature of time as a flow would be sunrise. Now, the sun actually doesn't rise, the earth turns. We still perceive it as the sun rising, we still describe it as the sun rising, and maybe we don't have to be maybe we don't have to police our language or even our perception to coincide with a rotating Earth, just as long as we're aware of it whenever that diverges from our common language and understanding.
So, Stephen, forgive me, I'm going to interrupt because I'm going to test the proposition that time expands, which is that it's 9:30, so we should be finishing. People are going to want to disappear, but I know that there are 3 people who I said I'd come to. So if I might, Stephen, just indulge us. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there, I'm Carlene. This is going to be a question, so I apologize. Right at the beginning, you spoke about outcomes and using rationality to achieve outcomes. And it feels like, as someone on one side of the rational, irrational, or seeing myself as being on one side of the debate, that irrational thinking can cause very bad outcomes, objectively bad outcomes, like dying from not getting a COVID vaccine, for example. So apart from sort of throwing your arms up in the air and saying, I told you so, what tools does the rational agent have to try and actually achieve better outcomes in the face of irrational arguments?
Now, are you specifically referring to the outcome of persuading other people who were probably mistaken in their beliefs?
I think that the goal would be to achieve the good outcome without having to sort of say, I told you so.
Yes,
so,
good outcome meaning persuading irrational skeptics.
Yeah, or I suppose that another way of framing the question is, like, do you believe that the arc of progress tends towards rationality and that in time people will sort of land on the rational argument? Or is it always going to be this case of, I told you so, the bad thing happened, and you just kind of accept and...
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the question of how do you persuade people, especially since all of us are, our beliefs are colored by our political coalition, and it's very difficult to give up sacred beliefs, not least because it makes you a pariah within your own community, which makes it perversely rational to hold on to those beliefs if your goal is not to suffer social death, to still have the support of your community. And that's why it's institutions such as journalism with fact-checking and editing, and liberal democracy with open debate, and academia with peer review. I mean, imperfect solutions to the problem that it can be perversely rational to cling to a belief that gains you status within your community, even if it's irrational in the community as a whole. I call it the tragedy of the rationality commons. And it's kind of a game theoretic situation in which everyone pursuing their own interest, in this case the interest being respect within your tribe, can lead to a globally unfortunate outcome. And you change the rules of the game in order to align the incentives of the individual with what is collectively our aspiration, namely truth. Given that those built-in impediments, how do you actually try to persuade someone out of a belief that's close to their identity? In some cases you can't. People will go to their graves believing something. They just, especially when it's considered to be a virtue, to be steadfast and courageous, and not to be a wimp and flip-flop. This dubious virtue, which I think we ought to try to deconstruct or to push back against. For the people who are, but aside from the true believers, there's always a fringe of people who will affirm something, but maybe more persuadable, and you can aim at those. Then there are always new babies are being born all the time, and they don't innately believe in crazy beliefs, and you can try to peel them off while they're still vulnerable. Even for those who are committed, there are tactics that are not strictly speaking rational or examples of critical thinking, but that can be effective, like finding a spokesperson from their coalition whose belief is more reasonable. I think it was a tremendous mistake of the climate movement, for example, to have a spokesperson like Al Gore, who was so identified with the left side of the spectrum, because then people on the right saying, well, good, I don't have to believe it. If you could find someone on the right who endorses human-made climate change, that would be tactically more effective.
Stephen, thank you. And there's a gentleman in the back.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned earlier kind of decision theory at the very start of your talk. So economists' solution to the prisoner's dilemma relies on their conception of rationality, like homo economicus, self-interest, or whatever. However, this is a losing move, as the optimum result would obviously be for both parties to cooperate, right? So decision theorists from different schools of decision theory try and make new theories to win these different Newcomb-like games, defining rationality differently or whatever. I mean, some of these lead to different responses to the prisoner's dilemma. So I guess my question, would be that do you think that there is a dissonance between game theory and decision theory? And what would this potential dissonance between economics and like actual rational decision theory actually have an impact in policy?
Yeah. No, I think they're closely aligned, and in fact, they were both introduced to the world by the same pair of mathematicians, von Neumann and Morgenstern, in the same book, Decision Theory and Game Theory. But it is indeed the mindset of game theory that identifies and makes all too plain the fact that each individual pursuing their self-interest could lead to an outcome that's worse for everyone, including them. So these are, I consider them to be two sides of the same coin, and they point the way toward a solution, namely change the incentives so that you can align what's optimal for the individual with what's optimal for the collective, including the individuals. So in the case of a prisoner's dilemma, there is no solution to a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, but you can change the rules of the game so it's no longer a prisoner's dilemma. And that, in fact, that's the way you ought to think about it, to make it more concrete and more relevant. In the case of a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, and that's what a tragedy of the commons is, say in the case of climate, it's the fact that it's in every individual's and every country's interest to consume fossil fuels, since any individual sacrifice won't save the climate. The problem being, if no one makes the sacrifice, then everyone is worse off in the long run. And a way to change that would be, I mean, and I'm not saying anything hugely original, but say carbon pricing changes the structure of the game. So if dirty energy is expensive enough, then it is in people's interests to switch to clean energy. Doing what's good for them is also what's doing good for the planet. Or inventing new technologies that are both cheaper and greener. So once again, you change the rules of the game so that the decision theoretic imperative, do what will maximize your expected utility, will also maximize everyone's utility when everyone pursues it individually. Namely, if it's cheaper to have clean energy, everyone will just opt for it out of self-interest.
Well, Stephen, I'm keenly aware that we've all got to get away and probably do things that are much less interesting than this conversation. So we nonetheless do have to get away. At the end of a ThinkIn, typically the editor tries to distill all the thoughts. And I'm going to do that by taking a comment from one of our members who just wrote, "Loving Pinker. What a thoroughly good egg he seems." So on that basis, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Pinker.